What if the most important battle in modern warfare isn't being fought where the explosions happen? What if the real contest is taking place hundreds of miles away? Inside fuel depots, shipping lanes, insurance markets, and the logistics networks that quietly determine whether an army can keep moving at all. Over the past several days, Ukrainian officials have reported another wave of long-range strikes targeting vessels and transport infrastructure connected to Russian logistics around the Sea of Azov. While many of the operational details remain difficult to verify independently, the broader pattern has become increasingly difficult to ignore. The headlines focus on drones. The larger story may be about supply chains. And if that's true, then what happens in a body of water that many Americans could barely locate on a map may ultimately have consequences far beyond the battlefield itself. Because once logistics become the primary target, the question is no longer who controls territory today. The question becomes who can still afford to sustain a war tomorrow. That distinction matters because modern militaries consume astonishing amounts of fuel. Tanks do not move without diesel. Aircraft do not fly without aviation fuel. Air-minus defense systems, radar sites, generators, maintenance vehicles, transport trucks, even field hospitals all depend on an uninterrupted flow of energy. Military history repeatedly shows that battles are often won or lost long before soldiers meet each other. They are won by whichever side can continue feeding, repairing, transporting, and supplying its forces after months or even years of conflict. Ammunition wins engagements. Logistics wins wars. For much of the conflict, the Sea of Azov has served as one of the logistical corridors supporting Russian operations in underground occupied Crimea and southern Ukraine. Geographically, the area offers several advantages. It is relatively enclosed, connected to the Black Sea through the Kerch Strait, and historically has been farther from the most active combat zones than many other maritime routes. That geography has made maritime transportation an attractive option for moving fuel and other military supplies. Roads can be damaged. Railways can be disrupted. Bridges can become vulnerable. Ships, under the right conditions, can move enormous quantities of cargo at comparatively low cost. But geography creates assumptions, and modern warfare has a habit of challenging assumptions. If long-range drones are capable of repeatedly reaching areas once considered relatively secure, then distance begins to lose some of its traditional value. Suddenly, the conversation shifts away from whether a particular vessel was damaged and toward a much larger strategic question. How expensive does it become to keep moving fuel if every voyage carries growing operational risk? At what point does protecting logistics consume so many resources that those resources are no longer available elsewhere? This is where many discussions stop too early. They focus on explosions instead of economics. Because ships carrying fuel are not simply transportation assets. They represent moving inventories of energy. Every voyage is also a financial calculation involving insurance, maintenance, crews, replacement costs, scheduling, and the opportunity cost of unavailable vessels. Damage to a single tanker is expensive. Increased uncertainty across an entire transport network is considerably more expensive. Modern supply systems depend not only on physical infrastructure but also on confidence that the next shipment will arrive on time. That brings us to a term that has become increasingly important since Western sanctions on Russian energy exports intensified the so-called shadow fleet. The phrase sounds dramatic, but the underlying concept is surprisingly straightforward. After sanctions, price caps, and restrictions on maritime insurance complicated Russia's traditional oil exports, analysts observed the growth of a network of aging tankers operating through more opaque ownership structures, alternative insurers, and jurisdictions with fewer regulatory requirements. Estimates of the fleet's exact size vary among different research organizations, but many agree that it has expanded substantially over the course of the war and now carries a significant share of Russian seaborne oil exports. That matters because energy exports remain one of Russia's most important sources of government revenue. Oil is not simply another commodity. It is one of the financial engines that help sustain state spending, including military expenditures. Every disruption to energy transportation, therefore, raises questions that extend well beyond shipping. It touches government finances, industrial output, foreign exchange earnings, and long-term strategic endurance. Now notice how the picture begins to change. At first glance, reports of drone attacks on tankers appear to describe a tactical operation. Look closer, and the same reports begin to resemble something different. Instead of asking whether a particular ship survived, analysts start asking whether an entire logistics model is becoming more expensive to maintain. Instead of asking how many drones were launched, they ask how many additional air-defense systems must now protect ports, bridges, ferries, depots, and shipping lanes simultaneously. Instead of asking how much damage occurred today, they ask how much cumulative cost will accumulate over the next 12 months. Those are completely different questions, and wars are often decided by the second set rather than the first. The same principle has appeared throughout military history. Destroying an enemy's industrial capacity outright is extraordinarily difficult. Gradually increasing the cost of sustaining that industry can sometimes prove far more effective. Economists sometimes describe this as imposing costs faster than an opponent can comfortably absorb them. Military planners often describe it as forcing difficult resource allocation decisions. Either way, the objective is remarkably similar. Every dollar spent defending one logistics corridor is a dollar unavailable for another mission. Every additional escort, repair, replacement vessel, or air-minus defense battery represents another layer of expense that compounds over time. So perhaps the most important question is not whether a handful of ships were targeted. Perhaps the more important question is whether the economics of moving fuel are beginning to change, because if the cost of transporting energy rises high enough, the consequences eventually spread far beyond one stretch of water. They begin to reshape military planning, then government budgets, then industrial production, and eventually, global energy markets themselves. And that is where this story becomes much larger than the Sea of Azov. If logistics is the bloodstream of modern warfare, then every disruption raises a larger question. What happens when an entire supply network becomes progressively more expensive to operate, not because it has been completely destroyed, but because every movement now carries greater risk? That is the strategic lens through which many analysts have begun viewing the campaign around Crimea. Rather than focusing on decisive battlefield breakthroughs, the emphasis appears to be shifting toward increasing the long-term cost of sustaining military operations. The objective may not be to eliminate every supply route. It may be to make every remaining route less efficient, less predictable, and more expensive than before. That distinction helps explain why transportation infrastructure has become such a prominent feature of the conflict. Bridges, rail lines, ports, ferries, fuel depots, electrical substations, and logistics hubs all perform the same essential function. They keep resources moving. They disrupt one link, and traffic can often be rerouted. It disrupts several links simultaneously, and the entire network begins to lose flexibility. The challenge is no longer replacing a single bridge or repairing one fuel depot. It becomes managing delays, shortages, maintenance schedules, security costs, and the constant need to adapt under pressure. Crimea illustrates this principle particularly well. Since 2022, multiple reports have described repeated strikes against transportation infrastructure connected to the peninsula, including bridges, ports, rail connections, airfields, fuel facilities, and military logistics sites. While the operational impact of any individual strike is often difficult to assess in real time, the cumulative effect is easier to understand. Modern logistics depends on redundancy. As redundancy disappears, every remaining route becomes more valuable and more vulnerable. This is where the story expands beyond military operations and into economics. Moving fuel is not simply a matter of loading cargo onto a ship. It requires functioning ports, trained crews, financing, maintenance, navigation systems, insurance coverage, repair facilities, and confidence that each voyage can be completed without unacceptable risk. As uncertainty increases, every participant in that chain begins adjusting behavior. Shipping companies reassess exposure. Insurers reevaluate premiums. Financial institutions reconsider lending risks. Maintenance becomes more expensive. Replacement vessels become harder to acquire. None of these changes make headlines on their own, but together they gradually alter the economics of maritime transport. That process becomes even more significant when older vessels are involved. Numerous independent studies have noted that many ships associated with Russia's so-called shadow fleet are considerably older than the global commercial average. Older ships generally require more maintenance, consume more fuel, and present greater operational challenges than newer fleets. If those vessels also operate outside many traditional insurance and financing systems, unexpected disruptions can become substantially more costly. A damaged vessel is one problem. Replacing a specialized vessel under sanctions and heightened geopolitical scrutiny is an entirely different challenge, and this is where many people misunderstand modern sanctions. Sanctions rarely function like an on-off switch. They are designed less to stop economic activity overnight than to steadily increase friction within a system. Every additional transaction becomes more complicated. Every shipment requires more work. Every workaround introduces additional costs. Over time, those costs accumulate. The question is not whether trade continues. The question is how efficiently it can continue. That same logic applies to military logistics. A convoy that requires escorts consumes more resources than one that does not. A bridge requiring constant protection ties down air-minus defense assets that could otherwise defend factories, command centers, or population centers. A logistics network operating under persistent threat demands more surveillance, more engineering support, more repairs, and more contingency planning. None of those expenses appear dramatic when viewed individually. Together, they reshape strategic priorities. There is another layer that often receives less attention. Military planners do not simply calculate how much an operation costs them. They calculate how much it costs their opponent to respond. Sometimes the most effective operation is not the one that causes the greatest physical destruction. It is the one that forces the other side into the most expensive defensive posture. If relatively inexpensive drones repeatedly compel the deployment of sophisticated air-minus defense systems, additional patrols, expanded surveillance, and continuous infrastructure repairs, the cost imbalance itself becomes strategically significant. The battlefield, in that sense, becomes an exercise in economics as much as engineering, but none of this guarantees a particular outcome. Wars rarely follow straight lines, and logistics systems are designed to adapt. Routes can be shifted. Infrastructure can be repaired. New supply methods can emerge. Governments can reallocate budgets. Industries can expand production. History repeatedly demonstrates that resilient states often absorb disruptions that initially appear severe. At the same time, history also shows that prolonged pressure on logistics can gradually erode military effectiveness even without dramatic battlefield defeats. That uncertainty is precisely why the developments around Crimea continue to attract such close attention. The individual incidents matter, but the broader trend may matter even more. Analysts are increasingly asking whether this represents the emergence of a different model of warfare, one in which long-range precision strikes are used less to seize territory directly and more to reshape the economic environment in which military decisions are made. If that interpretation proves accurate, then the implications extend far beyond Ukraine. Future conflicts may place greater emphasis on disrupting supply networks than destroying frontline formations. Energy infrastructure, ports, telecommunications, industrial facilities, transportation corridors, and financial systems could become just as strategically important as traditional military objectives. Victory would depend not only on battlefield performance, but also on which society can sustain industrial production, protect critical infrastructure, and absorb economic pressure over the longest period. That should matter to American viewers because global supply chains are deeply interconnected. Energy markets respond not only to production levels but also to transportation risks, insurance costs, and perceptions of future stability. Even localized disruptions can influence shipping patterns, freight rates, investment decisions, and commodity prices. The effects are rarely immediate or isolated. They ripple outward through financial markets, manufacturing costs, inflation expectations, and eventually the prices consumers encounter in everyday life. So perhaps the most important lesson from the Sea of Azov is not about drones, ships, or even Crimea itself. It is about the changing nature of power. For generations, military strength was measured by the number of tanks, aircraft, or warships a nation possessed. Increasingly, another question may be becoming just as important. Which country can keep its logistics moving when every mile of its supply chain is under pressure? Because in the 21st century, wars may still be fought on battlefields, but they are increasingly decided by the resilience of the systems that exist far behind them. And if that is true, then the next major turning point in a conflict may not begin with a dramatic offensive. It may begin quietly, with a disruption in the flow of fuel, a delay at a port, a change in insurance premiums, or a supply route that suddenly becomes just a little too expensive to keep using. That possibility raises a much larger question. As modern warfare continues to evolve, will future victories belong to the side that destroys the most weapons or to the side that most effectively reshapes the economic systems that allow those weapons to operate in the first place?